The battery industry growth over the last 10 to 15 years is truly unprecedented. Of course, all those same raw materials that were mentioned before, there's a key shortage that we're going to see in almost every one of these different elements. Seems very obvious. Probably many of you guys understand this, in the math, but when you really think of what it means for that industry, if you fast forward, let's say 50 years, when all the cars are electric, they've been electric for 5 or 10 years, and now we're not needing to mine these new materials. It's going to be a massive transition into a closed loop economy where everything is remanufactured, collected, and re-refined, but not mined. So we have a whole generational problem of how do we mine enough materials to build the fleet in the first place, but it will absolutely, inevitably, I'm 100% sure of this, transition into a closed loop economy. And amazingly, many people in the automotive industry still don't understand, I would say, these components as well as they need to. These are some of the most expensive components inside of an EV. Cathode is literally the single most expensive component in an EV, and so many OEMs don't even really understand what a cathode is yet.
In this video, Tesla co-founder and Redwood Materials CEO JB Straubel shares some juicy details about the early days of Tesla, the idiocy and blindness of legacy automotive manufacturers who still haven't done the math on the transition to EVs, skepticism among mining companies about the sheer amount of materials needed to transition the world to EVs and how fast this will be needed, and the truly massive, and I mean massive, transformation necessary in industry to transition the world to a sustainable economy. This is a very important video for Tesla stock investors, as JB details many of the steps Tesla themselves will need to take in the future and the sheer magnitude of what needs to happen. So let's get into it. Hey guys, thanks for watching. If you enjoy these videos, there's a bunch of ways you can support the channel, access exclusive content and perks. Check out the links in the pinned comment below. If you want to take it to the next level, join thousands of members on Patreon to gain exclusive access to over 100 Q&A videos, loads of exclusive content, exclusive access to my up-to-date 10-year Tesla stock price targets, and even access my Tesla valuation model at the investor support level and above. You can also pick up some Tesla, Elon, and investment themed merch in the merch store. So check out the links in the pinned comment below, and thanks for your support. As always, there's a link in the description to the full keynote from JB Straubel. In this video, we're just going to run through some highlights, and I'll add a few thoughts and comments along the way.
Why are we talking about building terawatt hours of battery supply? Why is this so important? Why are we going through all this crazy effort to dig up, lithium and nickel and everything else? We have a bigger imperative of how do we solve the issue of global CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. That's really why we're talking about electrifying everything. That's why gigafactories are relevant. That's why electric vehicles are relevant. And the magnitude of the challenge in front of us, but we have to electrify literally everything we do. Every part of our economy, every part of our society has to not burn fossil fuels. And it's kind of incredible when you think of that and go through your daily life and how many times that touches everything we do. But it's a massive undertaking.
Taking a quick moment here, as they say, the world's biggest challenges are also the world's biggest opportunities. Obviously, JB Straubel and Redwood Materials going after an enormous opportunity. But looking at this keynote and these comments through the lens of a Tesla stock investor in particular, essentially everything JB Straubel lays out in terms of what needs to happen, these are things that Tesla is or will be doing in the future. They may not have officially announced a lot of these things yet, but remember, Tesla has said 1,000,000 times, they will solve whatever the limiting factor is. The scale of this transition is truly colossal. Wherever the bottlenecks appear, Tesla will be applying their big brains and coming up with solutions, just like Redwood Materials.
So at Redwood, our goal is to help create a circular economy, to make battery materials more sustainable, to make the industry that's kind of behind the lithium-ion battery more sustainable. Our main focus areas, how do we increase the overall supply of battery materials? We simply don't have enough right now. So expanding the supply base, also reducing cost. There is this imperative to reduce cost, to get them into the markets where they need to be. Recycling and localizing supply chain, creating circular supply chains, in my view, is going to be one of the biggest long-term cost reduction drivers. There's a lot of other aspects, but I think this will be one of the biggest as raw materials become the majority of lithium-ion costs.
Were you paying attention? Recycling, creating a circular supply chain. In other words, materials into products, eventually recycled and back into new products. One of the biggest challenges. So what are the odds that Tesla's going to scale up their battery recycling efforts, and not only that, but also localize as much of the battery supply chain as they possibly can, including mining as close to a factory as possible, refining as close to a factory as possible, and localizing as much as they can on every continent they have a gigafactory.
And finally, how do we reduce environmental impacts of those batteries? So keeping a very close watch on the actual CO2 emissions, which are never going to be zero, but tracking them and trying to minimize them as we make batteries and as we solve the supply chain challenges, as we do more mining and more recycling is really important. The battery industry growth over the last 10 to 15 years is truly unprecedented. It's something like 500%, just looking out over the last 10 years, toward 2030. But if you go all the way back to 2015, and maybe 1 or 2 years before, as I was saying, when we first started to conceive of the first gigafactory, and looking from then until about 2030, it's well over 1,000% growth. And this is a huge industrial part of our society and economy. There's not very many things grow this quickly that are this big. So it's quite an unprecedented time. And I also feel that the nature of the problems are really shifting toward industrialization. In the first generation of this whole movement toward electrification and batteries, there were more technical challenges. Could we make the batteries work? Could we keep them from catching fire? Was the lifetime sufficient? Now we've shifted, I think, into a much different realm of focusing on how do we make enough of them? How do we solve the problems of scale? How do we, double, triple, quadruple capacity of all these critical materials and the batteries themselves, and do that while reducing cost? These are really the key problems of the next 5 to 10 years.
And once again, if you're listening closely, JB Straubel is essentially describing what Tesla will detail in their master plan part 3. How do they reach truly fucking absurd scale? As JB points out, in the early days with lithium-ion batteries, there was a lot of technical challenges. Will this thing even work? We're well beyond that point. It's not about does this work, it's about how do we drive the cost down so these things can replace everything in our global economy and completely transition the world to a sustainable energy economy. These are very different challenges.
Of course, all those same raw materials that were mentioned before, there's a key shortage that we're going to see in almost every one of these different elements.
If that's true, it is, but there will be massive shortages in terms of the necessary materials over the coming years and even decades. This is not only a major problem, but also a huge opportunity. But I want to talk a little bit more in detail about this. Of all the companies on the planet today who'll be producing products that require these materials, nickel, lithium, copper, and so on, would it be fair to say that the companies that A, did the math, and B, have taken the necessary steps to secure as much of these materials as possible, e.g. committing to enormous long-term contracts, shout out to Tesla, is it possible that these companies, such as Tesla, may fare a little bit better than just about everybody else who hasn't even figured out how much stuff they're going to need, let alone locked in the long-term supply contracts? I think that's probably fair. Speaking of, here we are over on the Reuters website, some news maybe a week old. Indonesia says Tesla strikes $5 billion deal to buy nickel products. That's billion with a B. Quote, US car maker Tesla has signed contracts worth about $5 billion to buy materials for their batteries from nickel processing companies in Indonesia. This news, interestingly, comes approximately 2 years after Elon Musk pleaded with mining companies on a Tesla earnings call. Literally, quote, please mine more nickel. At the time of Elon's request, he also added, we will essentially throw money at you. If you can supply nickel, we will agree to a gigantic contract. Next minute, $5 billion worth of nickel contracts. Surprise, surprise. So exactly how much is $5 billion worth of nickel contracts? Well, let's do some really rough math. Don't worry, I'm not going to go full limiting factor on you guys. Shout out to Jordan. Just want to do some really rough ballpark numbers to give you a sense of the scale of this contract, and also to contrast that with the complete and utter lack of long-term multi-billion-dollar contracts from other alleged automotive manufacturers who claim they're going to have lots of EVs on the road, yet they still haven't done the fucking math, let alone locked in the contracts. Big red flag. I really do want to underscore this point. Many tens of billions of dollars worth of materials will be necessary for every automotive manufacturer aiming to produce millions of electric vehicles per year in the future. Until you hear about these long-term contracts, these companies are not only not serious, they're so far behind, they haven't even done the fucking math, let alone locked in the materials contracts. But don't worry, as long as they've got a plan on their website that tells you what they're going to do, everything's going to be okay. The first thing we need to know, how much does nickel actually cost? Well, it's about $23 US per kilogram as I record this. Keeping in mind, a massive contract may mean Tesla's getting a little bit of a better deal on this. Let's just round this down to $20 a kilogram, just for some really rough numbers. Please don't get your panties in a twist. I'm just trying to make a point. So, $20 a kilo for nickel, The question now becomes, how many kilograms of nickel is in an average Tesla battery pack? And the answer is, well, I don't actually have any fucking idea. These things constantly change. The chemistry, reduction in weight, mass, blah, 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 blah. The point is, this is a moving target. The next thing we need to know is how many kilograms of nickel are actually in an electric vehicle. And obviously, everything you read on the internet is true. So we see here on mining.com that Tesla's models use an average of about 45 kilograms of nickel. However, that's including all models across the board, keeping in mind battery chemistry is a moving target. Depending on the vehicle, the performance specs and so on, there can be anywhere from 0 nickel up to 45 kilograms or more. According to Inside EVs, back in 2020 in August, 2 years ago, typical Tesla Model 3 contained around 30 kilograms of nickel. And more recent estimates, not specific to Tesla vehicles, but electric vehicles in general, EV cathodes, aka the stuff going in the vehicles. When we're talking about nickel, we're talking about the stuff going in the cathode, somewhere between 0 to 40 kilograms of nickel. So let's just say 30 kilograms of nickel. Over the next few years, the average is likely to be much lower, but let's be conservative here. So this is a calculator. You might have used one once or twice in your lifetime. So some pretty simple math here. 30 kilograms times approximately $20. That's how much nickel is going into every Tesla vehicle. In other words, the cost of nickel in an average Tesla, again, really rough numbers, pulling them out of my ass based on some stuff I read on the internet. The best I can do, sorry folks, about $600. Now all we need to do, divide 5 billion, the value of this nickel contract, by $600, and we'll see approximately how many Tesla vehicles in theory Tesla could produce based on this nickel contract alone. Keeping in mind, some vehicles don't need nickel in the battery at all. Chemistry is changing, it's a moving target, blah, blah, blah. We're looking at approximately 8.5 million vehicles. Remember, Tesla may be getting a decent deal on this nickel because of the contract being so fucking enormous. And over time, the battery chemistry improves. My best guess is that this will be about enough nickel for around 10 million vehicles. So where does this get Tesla to? And also, if Tesla's locking in a $5 billion contract for nickel just based on Indonesian supply, enough for give or take about 10 million vehicles when we factor in improving battery chemistry, reduction of mass, blah, 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 it seems they're kind of serious about reaching ridiculous scale. And it also seems that some of the dullards on Wall Street, haven't quite put two and two together, especially given some of their production estimates for Tesla toward the end of the decade. According to my estimates, in 2023, 24, and 25, this is based on my base case available in my Tesla valuation model to Patreon supporters at the investor level and above. In those 3 years, Tesla will produce approximately 10 million vehicles in total. But my best guess is significantly more than half of these vehicles will feature LFP batteries, in other words, 0 nickel required. If that's true, in the time it takes Tesla to use this $5 billion or so worth of nickel, again, keeping in mind these are nickel contracts, there could be all sorts of different nuance here, but just ballpark numbers, Tesla may actually need to produce around 20 million vehicles. That could see them through until mid to late decade, around 2026, 2027, maybe even a little later. So at a really rough level, it appears that just based on these contracts alone, Tesla may have locked in enough nickel alone for another approximate half decade of volume production. Something to keep in mind next time you hear Mary B.S. Barra espousing GM's plans to overtake Tesla tomorrow, despite not having any contracts locked in with anyone of any meaningful substance for any of the materials they need to actually achieve this publicly stated goal of bullshit. Don't get me wrong, we are hearing about a few deals behind the scenes with many legacy automotive manufacturers, but the scale of these deals really matters. Last I heard, Ford was aiming to produce just 2 million electric vehicles per year in 2026. Material supply contracts are in fact a wonderful leading indicator about future production capacity. And make no mistake, when a company like Tesla swings around their weight, locking in a $5 billion contract, this kind of thing sends ripples through the mining industry. Oh shit, they're actually serious. When Elon Musk says, please mine more nickel and we'll give you a gigantic, massive, very profitable, long-term contract, he was serious. Let's ramp up our nickel production or insert your material. Oh, and by the way, if in the future we're approached by a company like Tesla versus any other automotive manufacturer, and they all say they want a lot of materials and they all say they want a big contract, we now know that not only are they serious and willing to stump up the cash, but the amount of materials they need, 5 times, 10 times, 20 times more than anyone else is asking for. Should we even bother providing materials to these dweebs who want 1/10, 1/20th of what Tesla wants and aren't willing to commit to a super long-term contract, or should we just go, fuck it, you can have it all, Tesla? Something to consider.
You can't recycle something that doesn't exist yet. However, every year that goes by, we will have more and more recycled material content available in the market. And if we look far enough into the future, and maybe it seems like science fiction today, sitting here, of how can we get to this future state where all of the cars are electric, and where we have made the whole industry electric, these materials will be mostly in a closed loop. It's very different than petroleum, and this is just totally, different intuition. Many people, it's hard to grasp this, but all the battery metals that we have to mine and put into lithium-ion batteries don't get consumed in the applications. It seems very obvious. Probably many of you guys understand this, in the math, but when you really think of what it means for that industry, if you fast forward, let's say 50 years, when all the cars are electric, they've been electric for 5 or 10 years, and now we're not needing to mine these new materials. It's going to be a massive transition into a closed-loop economy where everything is remanufactured, collected, and re-refined, but not mined. So we have a whole generational problem of how do we mine enough materials to build the fleet in the first place, but it will absolutely, inevitably, I'm 100% sure of this, transition into a closed-loop economy. Today, this supply chain, if you, again, look at that whole critical mineral supply chain, the movement of materials and mining all over the world as they kind of come together to form a lithium-ion battery, it is complex. It's complex and it encompasses a lot of miles of transportation and a lot of emissions. There's also the time value of all these materials moving, through maybe 3 to 6 months of supply chain time. So, you have to invest, essentially, someone has to invest in owning that, atom of lithium, even as it originates in South America and then has to make its way, probably to China for some refining and conversion, then perhaps to Japan or Korea for inclusion into a cathode, and then it might move to North America or Europe to make itself into an electrode and into a battery and finally into a car. So if you ride along on that atom, it might travel tens of thousands of miles on average. Geology we can't fix. The elements occur where they occur in Earth's crust. That's something that we're not going to change. But once we mine them once and we move them to the market where the customers want to use them, then we have a chance to keep them there. And we can reduce that transportation need dramatically. So once we've mined nickel, once we've mined lithium and moved it to, let's say, North America, it would be really foolish to collect it, recycle it, and then send it all the way back halfway across the planet and do that whole journey one more time. We don't need to do that. So our goal is to link collection, logistics, diagnostics, checking about repairing batteries before we recycle them, then recycling, refining, and remanufacturing of battery materials, all in a geographic, tight location.
Clearly, there is an enormous amount of room for improvement when it comes to battery supply chain. And JB Straubel just laid out not only what Redwood Materials intends on doing over the next few years and decade plus, but exactly what Tesla themselves will be doing too. Everything JB mentioned there is something that Tesla will be doing actively. As he points out, a single atom required for a battery in an electric vehicle might travel up to 10,000 miles before it ends up in the end product. That is not only absurd, but just plain embarrassing. There's so much room for improvement here. And of course, the companies with the biggest scale have the greatest need to improve this. Even a slight improvement in efficiency can make enormous improvement in terms of the actual costs.
So that we can truly close the loop and keep these materials local. And the majority of our focus, well more than 50% right now, is focused on this battery material manufacturing of anode copper foil and cathode material. And amazingly, many people in the automotive industry still don't understand, I would say, these components as well as they need to. These are some of the most expensive components inside of an EV. Cathode is literally the single most expensive component in an EV, and so many OEMs don't even really understand what a cathode is yet.
I mean, his words, not mine. When I make fun of legacy automotive manufacturers, I mock and ridicule and point out their brain damage, their idiocy, their incompetence, and their blindness. I'm not doing it to be a dick. I'm describing reality. Don't take my word for it. JB literally himself. Most legacy OEMs don't even really understand what a cathode is. Keep that in mind next time you hear Mary B. Esparra taking a jab at Tesla, claiming that government motors will be outselling them in terms of electric vehicles in just a few years' time. You did it, Mary.
But between the cathode and the anode copper foil are included almost all of those critical metals that Simon mentioned in the beginning. So it includes all of the nickel, all of the cobalt, all the lithium, manganese if there is any, in the chemistry, as well as the copper. Now this is looking at a little bit different pie chart than was shown in the beginning. This is the cost of those overall components, the bill of material components. And the cathode itself, well more than 50% of the cost of a lithium-ion battery. So that single component is more than half the cost. That's kind of hard to sort of digest and think about. When we imagine the gigafactory, and all of this, the hundreds of gigafactories coming all over the world, those are really encompassing the kind of shaded areas. And I'm sorry, it's kind of hard to read the writing here, but up here is operating expense for the gigafactory. This is capital depreciation. So those are really what the gigafactory is. And you can see again today, it's quite less than 50%. Maybe it's 30 to 40% of the cost structure is what we typically think of a gigafactory. So focusing on cathode and anode, in my view, is the only way we're going to keep reducing the cost of a lithium-ion battery. You can't keep doing it by making the gigafactories bigger and more efficient. Even if you made them really zero cost, you'd still end up with something that's above most cost targets for lithium-ion batteries by the end of this decade. So again, a key focus has to be cathode and anode. This is what we're building today.
And I believe what Tesla will be building tomorrow.
We're embarking on a pretty ambitious battery materials campus. This is not a gigafactory. We don't build cells, but we build all the components that go into cells. And in my view, this is one of the missing pieces, especially in the US and largely in Europe as well, is that we don't have really any industry to make the components for a lithium-ion battery. If you put a new gigafactory today, here in Washington, D.C. or something, you would import almost all of those components from Asia, somewhere in Asia. And that, can work, but it's also not a great situation when you're trying to manage supply chain, when you're trying to manage cost, and when you're trying to manage the emissions of that supply chain as well. So we're focused on building this campus that includes both anode copper foil, cathode production, and recycling and refining all in one location. And we can gain a lot of efficiencies and a lot of synergies from linking these operations together. There's multiple steps where you don't have to crystallize something and package it and send it somewhere. You can keep it as a solution and move it from one stage in the process to another. It's really more is needed. We're trying to grow as fast as we possibly can, and I think these are pretty ambitious goals. We're targeting 100 gigawatt hours per year of these materials, production of these materials by about 2025. That's still only about 1 million EVs per year. So 100 gigawatt hours seems, in a gigafactory scale, it's maybe 2 or 3, depending on what's a nominal gigafactory today. But it's really still a drop in the bucket of what's needed in these markets. By the end of this decade, by 2030, we're aiming for about 500 gigawatt hours per year of production. Growing, again, as fast as we possibly can, but this is still a small fraction of just the need in North America alone. The global market, as was noted, is terawatt hours per year. So it's going to take, many companies doing something like this in just North America, to balance the market and to balance the need.
So I have a question. If what JB says is true, many companies just in North America alone will need to replicate this exact model. Obviously, Tesla among them, Redwood Materials also doing this. Seems like a logical step that every automotive manufacturer who intends on being in business by the end of the decade, aka the only vehicles they're producing are electric vehicles, will also need to do this. Or at the very least, outsource it and lose an advantage in terms of costs versus a company that's doing it themselves, vertically integrating, shout out to Tesla. If this is a necessary step in the process of mass producing electric vehicles, then surely companies like Government Motors and Ford will also need to do this themselves, or in the worst case, as I mentioned, outsource and lose a cost advantage. Now, I know this sounds a little bit crazy, but stick with me, folks. I personally have a funny feeling that this might be a slightly difficult challenge for companies who previously have experienced manufacturing ICE vehicles and that's it. Companies who aren't particularly agile or resourceful and don't have their pick of the world's best engineers. They don't have so many big brains able to solve these kind of problems, yet they still need to do this or go bankrupt. Just wanted to put that out there.
Well, it really is in some ways very similar to mining and refining associated with mining. The differences are that, in post-consumer feedstock, you have different sets of impurities, different combinations of elements. Normally lithium is never mixed in with nickel and cobalt. Geologically that doesn't really happen. So, there's interesting new, things needed and inventions needed on how to efficiently separate those. But one thing I think it is worth noting, many people think, recycling has this notion of, okay, well, if the thing you make out of recycling is kind of not as good as the first thing. It's sort of the brown paper, it's the sort of, ugly plastic. Metals are different. Metals are very, very different. And when we reprocess and recycle metals from an old battery, we actually have fewer geologic impurities. When you have to make the nickel pure out of rock, you have a long tail of stuff from the earth that was included in there. And people do a lot of hard work, the mining companies do a lot of work to separate that. The next time we refine it, it's actually more pure than the first time that it had to be refined. The analogy I think of is like, say you had water that you put through a fancy filtration system. If you put it through that filtration system multiple times, it just keeps getting more and more pure. The first time when you get it out of a well or something like that is the dirtiest water you're going to have. So very different than sort of plastics or glass recycling where you have polymers and such. At Tesla, the first gigafactory concept was kind of born out of necessity. I wish I could say we had this brilliant foresight and we were planning, the future of the whole market. But, in a lot of ways, we just were looking at what absolutely had to be done to meet the needs for Model 3. And I remember quite clearly, sitting around as we were trying to, figure out the supply chain needed for that vehicle. Back then, we were, aiming to build a few 100,000 cars a year. This was, hugely ambitious. We weren't even sure if there'd be customers. Most people doubted there would be. But at 300,000 or 400,000 units a year, it needed more lithium-ion batteries than the whole world produced. In the year that we were sitting there, on some table contemplating this. So, in that type of market, going out to source from the market, doesn't really work. You can't go to existing markets and say, oh, by the way, we'd like to, buy as much as you've made in total. So, I and others really saw that as an opportunity to kind of redefine the market and to drive the investment into bigger economies of scale and to say, okay, well, if we're going to drive this demand, we should architect it in a way for the greatest cost efficiency, for the greatest synergy with the vehicle assembly locally. And that all kind of came together to say, well, somebody has to make a battery factory that's this massive thing that's never been done before. If you want to make this many EVs, they go hand in hand. And it was patently obvious when you looked at the numbers needed for the supply chain, but the result of it was kind of unintuitive and terrifying. So that was sort of the beginning of it. The vision, again, was to integrate a lot of it, to vertically integrate as much as we could. We had hoped, frankly, to integrate more of the supply chain way back then, but it proved a little too difficult. It was sort of a bridge too far, on the first step of this, and building, one factory and moving this to North America where it had never been done before, where there were a lot of firsts, and trying to move the supply chain at the same time was a little too risky and too much. But I feel like that still hasn't really been solved yet. I know people are making plans. There's movement and talk of bringing cathode and other materials to North America. But as we sit here today, and the graphs you showed, there's no color on those bars. You look at North America and metals refining and battery bill of materials manufacturing, it's pretty much sitting at zero.
Once again, if you're listening closely, we just heard another hint, a bit of a preview, maybe even a bit of a spoiler about what may be contained in Tesla's Master Plan Part 3.
When you went to your suppliers back in 2014 and said to them, we want you to supply us the entire world's production of lithium-ion batteries, please. What was their reaction?
Yeah, it was not always super positive. Usually those discussions started with some level of trying to convince them that there would actually be a demand for electric vehicles. It was pretty painful because we'd have to, on one hand, the goal was secure investment for tens of gigawatt hours of capacity, and then on the other hand, we'd be walking into a room where people were freaked out that EVs weren't even going to happen. So lots of discussion of Nissan Leaf and how that had just failed and nobody wanted EVs. So it kind of started with justifying, trying to explain the market, sell. It seems ridiculous today, given where we sit in the market, but only a few years, 10 years ago, we were trying to sell to suppliers and explain to them that there would be demand. And, I still think we see this actually in the mining industry. I feel actually some similar feeling when we go, even today to talk to mining companies. They still, I think, are more skeptical that any of this is real. They're kind of like, yeah, we'll see it evolve over the next 10 years and we'll respond when we get there.
This is another very important point. Early days of Tesla, unsurprisingly, Tesla's the only company on the fucking planet that knew EVs would be the future because A, they had brains, and B, they used them. They thought, oh, okay, technology's improving. Range is a little bit lame at this point in time, but over time, energy density improves. We drive down the costs. Oh, wait, these will actually be viable. Wait, they'll not only be viable, they'll be superior. In the future, a compelling electric vehicle will actually cost significantly less, not only to operate and maintain, but also to purchase than an equivalent ICE vehicle. If that's the case, yeah, we should make these things. Next minute, Tesla's trying to convince the world that this is true. No one listened. But now JB points out the exact same shit is happening with mining companies. Although Tesla's recent $5 billion nickel deal with Indonesian suppliers may start to turn the tide.
Yeah, that was the case with battery manufacturers and component manufacturers, the first wave of building the first gigafactory. One of the bigger challenges was the lack of human expertise in these areas in North America. You can't just sort of teleport this whole industry in, without a whole bunch of, training and getting a new workforce up to speed. So, having close proximity to a lot of engineering talent and being able to redeploy engineers, who used to be working on, who knows what, whether it was software or IT or vehicle engineering, and saying, okay, well, actually now you're going to come help us make a battery factory work and actually run appropriately. Being able to do that in the same time zone and within a 3-4 hour drive was really quite important. And I think it was more important than saving perhaps another ½ cent per kilowatt hour of electricity, or perhaps having a tiny bit lower labor cost or something like that.
Interesting.
The world is in a different place now, and I think now we need to be focused more on marginal economics and scaling. But the first one was really about making it work, and the bigger risk was that it just wouldn't work properly or wouldn't start on time, or even later than it actually already was.
Next question. What are the challenges in setting up a cathode material operations in the US?
There's some very similar parallels to what I just described. The US has lost or atrophied a lot of its chemical engineering and chemical processing industry. We still, of course, do a lot of petrochemical processing, but when you look at metals refining, metals processing, chemical manufacturing, these are industries that have kind of moved out of the US. So when we look at building and bringing a large cathode manufacturing facility to North America, we have to, again, look at knowledge transfer, training, understanding how to, find the appropriate workforce, even the supply base to build the equipment for the factory. It's sort of this never ends really. And you build a cathode facility, and then you start focusing on all the different pieces of equipment and who makes those and where do those come from. So lo and behold, a lot of that supply chain also isn't in the U.S. We have to start making sure we have support from Asian companies who are maybe making kilns or different components. This has to happen. None of these are excuses not to do it. There are reasons why it might be difficult, and there are challenges. But those are the ones I'd say we're focused on right now. My fear is that our investment is way out of whack throughout that whole supply chain. I think it's right now probably over-focused on investing in battery assembly capacity. Yeah. And that investment, it's needed ultimately. So it's not a question of do we need it in the long term, but if it runs ahead of the raw materials, it's going to get choked off, and you'll have big price volatility, which ultimately can end up kind of harming consumers' confidence in EVs. When EV prices skyrocket, everyone says, well, geez, these things are not affordable. They aren't really what we thought they were. They're not working. But in reality, it's more gyrations in the market trying to get itself scaled. Anyway, that I think is probably my bigger fear of the overall state we're in, is how can we do this 1,000% growth and do it without huge price shocks that hurt the whole market.
Turbulent times ahead, no doubt. And I believe the company clearly most well positioned to navigate these rough seas, Tesla. It's not to say it's going to be easy. After all, we've seen Tesla's been forced to raise their prices up to 35% on their vehicles over the last 18 months, in part due to insane demand, which doesn't help, but also due to increasing materials costs. As we know, Tesla has already won the decade. They're in an unassailable lead, a dominant position. This is not up for debate, but even Tesla will have their share of challenges. The question I want to ask in closing this video, if JB Straubel, founder of Redwood Materials, is concerned, it seems pretty clear from my perspective. There are two companies in the United States who know what needs to happen and are moving as fast as they possibly can. One of them already has enormous scale, that would be Tesla, and the other, Redwood Materials, are moving in that direction. But outside of these two companies, I'm not seeing a lot of positive signs. There's a lot of talk from legacy automotive manufacturers about their alleged plans, their EV strategy, how much they're investing in this, that, or the other. But none of them seem to be acknowledging these bottlenecks out loud or doing anything to solve them. And remember, a company like Tesla with their scale, showing the seriousness, the fact that they're locking in multi-billion-dollar supply contracts for single materials, is a signal to all companies producing these materials, refining these materials. Tesla's serious. They ain't fucking around. And when a company like Tesla knocks on your door and says, hey guys, we need literally everything you can give us and then some for the next decade. Or by the way, here's a multi-billion-dollar contract. And then you've got somebody like Government Motors going, oh, hey guys, we think we might need a tiny bit of this thing, but we don't really know anything. So could we have some? Who ultimately ends up locking in the long-term supply contract and getting the materials necessary to achieve their goals. Something to think about. So I hope you guys and girls have enjoyed this video. I really do encourage everybody watching, pay attention to what Redwood Materials are doing. We're seeing some insights into Tesla's future plans before they're unveiled. Both companies essentially essentially very similar goals. Obviously, Tesla's doing a little bit more. They're at a larger scale, but at the end of the day, everything JB Straubel talks about Redwood doing, all of the challenges they need to solve, localizing supply chain, everything, these are the same challenges Tesla themselves will be facing, addressing, and ultimately overcoming. And lastly, don't forget you can support the channel by joining Patreon with the card in the corner or the link at the pinned comment. You'll gain access to well over 100 exclusive Q&A videos, dozens of other exclusive videos, loads of content and perks, including instant up-to-date access to my Tesla stock price targets out over the next decade. So I'll see you over on Patreon. I'm Stephen Mark Ryan. This is Solving the Money Problem, and I love you all. Hey guys, thanks for watching. If you enjoy these videos, there's a bunch of ways you can support the channel, access exclusive content and perks, and get some free stocks and crypto. Check out the links in the pinned comment below. You can also pick up some Tesla, Elon, and investment themed merch in the merch store. If you want to take it to the next level, join thousands of members on Patreon to gain exclusive access to over 100 Q&A videos, loads of exclusive content, exclusive access to my up-to-date 10-year Tesla stock price targets, and even access my Tesla valuation model at the investor support level and above. So check out the links in the pinned comment below, and thanks for your support. And if you're still watching, you're awesome. I read every single comment on this channel and I really appreciate your feedback. So if you've got any thoughts on today's video, questions, comments, or suggestions for a new video, let me know in the comments below. Check the cards on screen now to browse the merch store, join Patreon, or watch the next video.